So converting between fractions, decimals, and percentages. We should be aware by now that these are all basically the same thing, just written differently. We can write a fraction as a percentage, we can write a decimal as a fraction, we can write a decimal as a percentage. So today we're just going to be talking about the ways that we can convert easily between all three. So we know that 50% of a quantity...
Does that mean like 100?
No, a quantity could just be like something. So a quantity look like 10 water bottles or like some sort of object. So 50% of a quantity is the same as half of it. As the same as half of it. Or we can say a half. Or how can I write that as a decimal, Michael?
0.5.
Or 0.5, yeah. So a half, we could say 0.5 or 1 over 2.
Like 2 over 4.
Yeah, but you'd simplify that down to 1 over 2.
And also, can't you write 0.25 plus 0.25, which is in half?
Let's just leave it as 1 for right now.
Okay.
25% of a quantity. So now we're talking 25% is the same as what, Stella? A quarter of it. And how would I write that as a decimal, Thashara?
0.25.
Or 0.25.
Smart child.
So you see, we've got 50%. I can write that as 0.5, or I could write that as half. 25%, I could write that as a quarter, or I could write it as 0.25. So, fractions, decimals, and percentages are all interchangeable. We can really use whatever one we want in terms of trying to solve problems. They're all, not interchangeables, interchangeable, which means we can convert.
The 25% you also forgot to write or quarter. Yeah, I was going to pick that up.
It's right there.
No, but then for 50% you said...
Oh, okay, yeah. I got ya. I didn't put the word in.
Yes, and yeah, because it was smart child.
So, fractions, decimals, and percentages are all interchangeable. It means we can convert between all three. We can go from a decimal to a fraction. We can go to a fraction to a percentage, and so on and so on. So, let's just get through some of the things we're going to do. So, for a percentage, the symbol for percentage is that little dash with the 2 lines above or below. That's how we denote a percentage. And it means percent. Okay? Percent is a Latin phrase. Okay? And it translates roughly to out of 100. So that's why our percentages are out of 100, because percent out of 100. So 23%, that would be 23 out of 100. 14%, 14 out of 100, and so on and so on. So we're going to need to know how to convert between all of these, okay? So first thing we do is convert from a percentage to a fraction. So to convert a percentage to a fraction. First thing we should do is ignore the percent sign and write it as a fraction. So if we ignore the percent sign, Yana, how could we write something if it's a percentage as a fraction?
Wait, can you ask that again?
So ignoring the percent sign, if I have a percentage, so let's say 45%, how would I write 45% as a fraction?
Since it's percent, which means out of 100, you would do 45 dash 100.
Exactly. Since it's 45% and we know that a percent is out of 100, we can just write it as a fraction over 100. So we'll just use that same example. We'll use 45%. So 45% goes to 45 over 100 because we know it is per 100. And now the last thing we always have to do is we always have to simplify our fractions. And how would I simplify it, Thashara?
You can divide it by 5.
So divide both of them by 5. And what's the numerator divided by 5, Samara?
9.
Yep, and the bottom denominator is going to be what? What's 100 divided by 5? 20, exactly. So we can leave the fraction as 9 over 20. I can't simplify that any further, so that would be how I leave it. Tashara?
What if it's 100 over 45?
Well, that wouldn't be a percentage.
I know, but what's up higher than 100? The percent, like 125%.
It'd be 1 point something if we convert it to a decimal, or 1 and something in terms of fractions, or 115%. Okay, and we'll get into things about that probably next week sometime. So now to convert from a percentage to a decimal. In my opinion, this is probably the easiest one. Yana?
Can I show you how you do it?
Of course you can tell me how I do it.
Okay, so, you, let's say you also ignore the sign.
Yep.
And then, you just basically write 0 and then point the number.
Yes, so ignore the percent sign and then write 0 point the number. Or there's an actual mathematical way we can get to that 0 point the number, and it's dividing by 100. Since you all would have done your homework over the weekend, you all know what happens when we divide something by 100. That's when we move the decimal point 2 spots to the left.
And then if you add it.
So if we have 57%, and I want to make that into a into a decimal, it goes to 57 divided by 100. When I divide by 100, I move a decimal point 2 spots left. It's going to get me to 0.57. And that is the percentage as a decimal. Which is why I wanted us to make sure we're all on top of how to do all of these things. Now, if I want to go from a percentage to a decimal, how do we think we get from a decimal to a percentage? Bree?
From a decimal to percentage.
Yeah.
You put a dot in front of the number. And then add a 0 in front of that dot.
We already have a decimal. We want the decimal to a percentage.
Hold on. You times it by 100.
Yeah. If we get from a percentage to a decimal, we divide by 100. To go the other way, we just have to times by 100. So to convert a decimal to a percentage, we times by 100. So let's say I have 0.18. Well, that's just turned into 0.18 times 100, because that's how I'm going to get that to a percentage. Moving that decimal point to the right 2 spots. So how much percent is that going to give me, Drishti? 18%, exactly. There's one more conversion we need to consider. Does anyone know what that is? Yana?
Decimal to a fraction? Or... Yeah.
No, we've touched on that already. It's a fraction to a percentage. How do we get from a fraction to a percentage? So, let's just write to convert. Bree, I see your hand. Hold up. A fraction to a percentage. Yes, Bree?
Can you give me something so I can see the answer, like a fraction, just to put into a percent?
Oh, sure. Okay, so let's just 1 over 6. So to convert from a fraction to a percentage. So what we're going to do is multiply the fraction. What would I be multiplying my fraction by, Yana?
You could also divide, like, or if you want to multiply the fraction, you multiply it so we can, I don't know what that means, the bottom number.
It looks like you're doing a TikTok dance or something.
Like the bottom
The
number.
denominator?
Yeah.
Yep.
So that can equal 100.
Yes. So we want to make the denominator equal to 100, but there's also an even easier way. We just multiply the whole fraction by 100.
100 over 6.
Okay? So we multiply the fraction by 100 as well. To convert from a decimal to a percentage, we just multiply by 100. Well, a decimal and a fraction realistically are the same thing, just written in different ways. So to go from a fraction to a percentage, we can just multiply that by 100 also. If I've got 1 over 8,
I thought it was 1 over 6.
we're not doing 1 over 6. I'm just doing a different example.
Oh. Can I answer the example?
Sure, in 2 seconds. 1 over 8 times 100. What's another way I can write 100 so that we are multiplying fractions? Tashara?
100 over 100.
Not over 100, Drishti.
Over 1.
Over 1. Anything divided by 1 is just itself. So I can write 100 as 100 over 1, and now we're multiplying fractions. Times 100 over 1. And now let's try and simplify our factors. Okay? We can make some of those numbers a bit smaller, which helps with our multiplication a little bit. Is there any common factors that I can cancel out, Kalia? Ones. So the ones are just going to become ones. So I don't see the point in doing that. What about the 8 and the 100? Is there anything I can divide both of them by? 2. So if I divide that by 2, I get 4 over 50, right? I can do it again. Divide by 2 again, and what does that get me, Siana?
25.
Yeah, so 2 over 25. So now let's go and let's do 25 over 4. Sorry, over 2. 25 over 2, I'm sorry. And what's that going to get me? What's 25 divided by 2, Bree?
12 and 1 over 2.
12 and 1 over 2, or 12.5%. Everyone following that?
Wait, wouldn't it be 125%?
No, it is 12.5%.
I didn't know you could have, like, decimals as a percentage.
What do you mean decimals as a percentage?
Like, I didn't know you could have the dots
In a percentage, you can. Yep.
Can you have the dots of the fraction?
No, you cannot have a decimal in a fraction. You can have a decimal in a percentage.
It wouldn't make sense if it was like 1.5 over.
Yeah. All right. We happy?
Yeah. Hyper's a person who
We're going to do a fair bit of conversions as examples, just so we make sure we're getting the hang of all of it. Convert to fractions. So we've got 160%. We've got 0.75. And then we've got 12.5%. So how would I make that first one into a fraction, Adrian?
So we have to simplify it.
So we simplify that first one, but what are we simplifying, dude? There's just the 160 there. Remember, well, that percent, what does that mean? What does it mean when we say percent?
It's per 100.
Yeah, per 100, so out of 100. So if it's 160%, I can write it as 160 over 100. So that goes to 160 over 100, because all percentages are out of 100, and then we simplify now. And what can we simplify to?
Can't we cross out the 2 zeros at the end?
Let's get rid of the 2 zeros first off. Then we've got 16 over 10. Sienna? Pardon?
1 and 6 over 10.
1 and 6 over 10. Or 8 over 5. Both would give you the same answer. So we'll simplify it down to 8 over 5. Or you could also write 1 and 3 over 5. Right. Again, I always like improper fractions. I will always leave them as improper fractions. Just be careful because some questions may ask you to write them as mixed numbers. So whatever the question asks, always follow that. Otherwise, I'm happy with improper fractions. 0.75 as a percentage, Georgina. Sorry, as a fraction. I'm sorry.
3 over 4.
3 over 4. I see how you got there. I'm just going to go step by step first. So 0.75, remembering our place values, our 0, that's our units, our 7, that's in our tenths spot, and our 5, that's in our hundredths spot, which means we have 75 over 100. 75 hundredths, which I can write as 75 over 100. And we know that's equal to 3 over 4. So that is how we got the answer 3 over 4. %12.5 as a fraction. Kate. So we see it's a percent again. We had a percent here. What did we do for this one?
Put the 0.
But what did we do first? How did we write it? Yeah, put it as a fraction over 100. So let's write 12.5 as a fraction over 100, which is going to be just 12.5 over 100.
Do you forget the decimal?
You don't forget the decimal. Remember, we just said we don't like decimals in fractions. We don't want it at all. So we can change that numerator by multiplying.
Oh, we can put the 0.5 as a half, right?
So what should I multiply that by to get rid of the decimal? Amber? 10's a good idea, but there's actually a much easier way to do it. Yana?
You can multiply by 2.
By 2. It's a half, so we just want to get rid of it. So you multiply by 2. Which is going to be 25. What I do to the numerator, though, what do I also have to do to the denominator? The exact same thing, which is going to give me what, Tristy? 200. So now it's 25 over 200. And that simplifies down to 1 over 8. Yep. Thumbs up? Cool. Next one. Convert to decimals. So now we want our final answers to be in decimal form. So first off, we'll have 723%. We can absolutely have more than 100% of something if we just get even bigger than it, right?
Yes.
Hi.
So 723% is possible, and now we want to write it as a decimal, sorry. So how do we write a percentage as a decimal? What was our steps?
You ignore the sign and then you divide it by 100.
Ignore the sign, divide by 100.
Which would equal 7.2.
and that's your answer.
Can't you like?
Okay? 7.23 is 720%, 723% as a decimal. 13.45%. Sean, what would we do here?
Convert it into a decimal.
Yeah, and how do we convert a percentage to a decimal? Exactly, we divide by 100. So we're going to be dividing this by 100 as well. So divide by 100. And when we divide by 100, what do we do to the decimal point? Move it 2 units to the left. 1, 2, 0.1345. You need to include those last 2 digits as well. You need the 45 there because that was there in the question. You can't just get rid of it magically.
What's wrong? Geez, I have a full box.
Last one. Convert to percentages. First one, we're going to have 7 over 40. Now, how do we make a fraction into a percentage again, guys?
Times by 100.
We times by 100. So we're going to times 7 over 40 by 100. So 7 over 40 times 100 over 1. Maddie, how can I simplify that? How can I simplify this? Is there anything I could take out of the top and the bottom? 10. So let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of that. Is there anything else now I can work with? Leo?
Yeah.
What else can I cancel out?
You could cancel out, wait, am I going to put this down?
Let's start listening. Yeah?
I don't think we cancel anything
We
out.
could divide both these by 2, so that's 5 and that's 2. This makes this a lot easier. If you were to multiply this out, it'd be 700 over 40. You don't like that, okay? No one likes that. It's an ugly thing to work with. So start cancelling them out while they're still like this and we can understand it, because this gives us 35 over 2, which is much easier for us to work with. And it gets us to 17.5%.
How do you pick it up?
35 divided by 2. Yep. C, 2 and 1 over 4.
Where's B?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, B. That's what I meant. B. So we got 2 and 1 over 4, and we want to try and write that finally as a percentage. Tashara.
Do we convert it into a calculator?
No. What we can actually do... So...
Oh, would the 2 be like the whole, like the 2.2?
Mm-hmm. We can say that's 2 and a quarter times 100. Well, do we remember when we did expanding expressions back when we did our algebra? I can write 2 and a quarter. I can write that as 2 plus 1 quarter. The 2's still there. The quarter's still there. We're just separating them. Now I'm going to times them both by 100. So what's 2 times 100?
200.
What's a quarter times 100? 25. So now we have 200 plus 25, and that's going to get me to 225%.
What? Can't you do 2.25%?
It is not 2.25% though. 2.25% would assume that we're getting smaller. So for example, if I got 2.25% on the test, or I got 225% of the test. They are much different things.
Wait. But can't you do 2.25 and then times it by?
Oh, yes, you can do that if you wanted.
Would that be easier? Or
It would be, but you can't always convert the fraction to nice decimals. Like sometimes it might be 2 and 5/7, and you don't know that off the top of your head. If it's off the top of your head like that, and you've got 2 1/4, you can change it to 2.25, but it just depends on the question and if you can do it. Yana,
Can you change it into like 9/4? Because it's like.
you can do that as well. Yep. Any questions?
No.
Okay. For those of you watching at home, as you go into course information, all this stuff will be in the calendar when I fill it in on Tuesday. Everyone says hi from the class.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
And the questions will be on the page as well.
don't